on this edition of The Fifth Estate.
Is it metal or was it that? Metal.
Undercover police stories is seen from the inside.
Are you a fucking parent?
Cops impersonate criminals so murderers will confess.
That's 300 to 400 murderers who are not on the street right now.
It's called a Mr. Big sting, Canada's most controversial police technique, now under attack.
No body, no evidence. There is nothing to support his version of events at all.
When the good guys play bad guys, how do you know if a confession is true or false?
I will not say I did. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. That's it.
I'm Bob McEwen at the Monroe Correctional Center in Monroe, Washington. This is The Fifth Estate.
Outside Seattle, behind the gun towers and razor wire, is a man known as one of Canada's most notorious killers, though he claims to be a victim of an ill-conceived and reckless Canadian police operation. Atif Rafay was 18, a freshman at Cornell University, when he and his Vancouver high school friend Sebastian Burns were implicated in the triple murder of Rafay's own family. Now, closing in on 40, they're both serving 3 consecutive life sentences with no chance of parole. Their only hope, a decision in 2014, 4,000 kilometers away at the Supreme Court of Canada, that's called into question past Mr. Big stings and placed limits on how the technique may be used in the future. Mr. Big essentially was invented by the RCMP and rarely is used anywhere else in the world. Police say it's resolved hundreds of murder cases. For 25 years, it's been accepted as a legitimate law enforcement practice. But after the 2014 Supreme Court ruling, the undercover operation can only be used under certain strict guidelines. For example, if a confession were obtained by targeting the vulnerable, or taking advantage of physical or mental weakness, or if there were threats or other inducements to confess, all might render a confession unreliable. Over the years, the Fifth Estate has covered numerous Mr. Big cases, some of which we'll tell you about here, but none is more infamous than the story of Canadian boyhood pals Atif Rafay and Sebastian Burns. It was July 13th, 1994. The Rafay family had just moved from Vancouver to Bellevue, Washington. Early that morning, there was this 911 call.
What are you reporting? My friend, his mom and dad, we think they're dead.
Police arrived to find Atif Rafay's mother and father beaten to death. His 20-year-old disabled sister barely clinging to life, and 2 teenage boys waiting outside the house. What followed was a pattern of bizarre behavior that focused suspicion squarely on Atif and Sebastian, both 18. After the murders, they skipped the family funeral to take a Greyhound bus back across the border to British Columbia. They refused to be interviewed by investigators. At a memorial service in a Vancouver mosque, they fled from the media.
Atif, why don't you talk to police?
Before long, they weren't only the prime suspects of the murder case in Washington, but also the targets of a secret Mr. Big sting in Canada. Think of Mr. Big as a crime-fighting video game in which police officers impersonate criminals to solve a murder. First, an undercover officer makes friends with the murder suspect under the guise of being a gangster. Next, the suspect is offered jobs with the gang. Finally, the suspect is introduced to the crime boss, Mr. Big, who offers to help make the murder charge go away, but only for someone who can show the right stuff by admitting he's already killed. It is the fundamental Mr. Big formula. And in the case of Rafay and Burns, it began a few months after the killings, when suspect Burns had what seemed an accidental meeting with someone, then a few drinks at a strip club. Burns believed he had met a criminal gang member. In fact, it was an undercover cop. Soon, Burns was offered thousands to make what he thought were illicit bank deposits for the gang. And eventually, he was introduced to the boss, Mr. Big, at a hotel in Victoria, BC. On this surveillance video, as always, the Mr. Big character is either off camera or seen only with his face blurred. Here, the boss claims he can influence the murder case in the U.S., and to prove it, he reveals what's supposed to be a secret police memo about Raffay and Burns.
Just read this piece of shit. That was fucking turned over units that we destroyed.
But to get Mr. Big's help, they first have to gain his trust by describing what happened on that gruesome night at the Raffay house. It's a chilling inside view of a police undercover operation.
Well, both guys woke up one day and said, hey, let's go off your family and fucking get all their money?
Basically. Essentially, yeah, I mean.
Mr. Big begins with Burns.
How have you ever fucking killed 3 people at once?
I don't watch it when I did it.
Over 25 years, a handful of undercover officers have been Mr. Big, always anonymously. You're about to hear the story of one of them, in his own words, on camera. Al Hazlitt was one of the originators of the technique in the early 90s. Recently retired from the RCMP, he now can talk about his dozens of cases as Mr. Big, coaxing confessions from murder suspects like Raffay and Burns.
So you're the pros who are called in to get the confession, and that's the end of your job for the time being.
Not get the confession. Seek the truth. We don't go there. We don't wake up in the morning and say, we're going to get confessions. This is not a bunch of cowboy cops going out and doing this. This is planned. The scenarios are planned, thought out, and we go to seek the truth.
Listen as Sergeant Hazlitt tries to test Sebastian Burns' story against what's known about the Raffay murders. The details are shocking. Burns confirms the police theory the murder weapon was a baseball bat.
Would you use a metal or a wooden bat? Metal.
Burns reveals why there was no trace of blood on his body afterwards. He took a shower, but that's not all.
How do you fucking, it's on a baseball bat. You have to shower, no blood on you.
Do it naked.
Then Atif Raffay tells his story.
How's it feel killing your parents and my father and sister?
Pretty rotten, but it's tempered by the fact that I felt that it was necessary.
Why?
Raffay claims they did it for the family's insurance money.
It was necessary to, I guess, achieve what I wanted to achieve in this life.
The whole thing was to seek the truth, seek their involvement, whether or not they were involved in that murder in the States.
Former Mr. Big Al Hazlitt maintains even 20 years later, he's still persuaded what he heard was the truth.
So when you see that confession in its entirety, when you see how Burns interacted throughout the undercover operation, there's no doubt that that confession is real.
But there is someone who has an abundance of doubt about that.
I'm presuming that you may not agree with all that you've just heard.
It's a fair presumption.
Marie Henein is a leading Toronto defense counsel.
We will say whatever we have to say in a court of law.
Many may first have heard her name because she represents former CBC radio host Jian Ghomeshi against charges of sexual assault. But weeks earlier, we contacted her because she also acted for the man who was the target of the Mr. Big sting at the center of the crucial Supreme Court decision in 2014. She cautions in criminal confessions, appearances can be deceiving.
Youth is a factor, and anyone who has interacted with a 17-year-old boy has to know how stupid they are and how they will say just about anything. What you want to think about is what's coming out of their mouth true? And you know, with a lot of 16, 17-year-old boys, it ain't.
But what about the body language and attitude of Raffay and Burns as they describe the murders to Mr. Big?
Did anyone fight?
Yeah. Well, that's a story that hasn't really been told, because basically, with father, it was nothing, and curious episode was, the sister who basically, was standing up and walking around or whatever. F-word.
When you listen to Sebastian Burns talk about that night, talking about Atif's sister who objected to being bludgeoned, and he's leaning back and he's got his hands behind his head. He looks on the video to have a smug grin.
I think forensically to say, well, is this a statement that leads me to believe it's more likely to be true than not? But, you know, the fact that he says it with bravado, that doesn't tell me that he did it. It tells me he's a guy that speaks with bravado.
But Al Hazlitt says he believes Burns, who was 19 at the time, wasn't showing off, just being himself.
He said it in that way to sell it.
Right.
Because he wanted it to be convincing. He wanted Mr. Big to believe.
It's what come out of his mouth that convicted him.
Indeed, soon after their confessions, Raffay and Burns were arrested and taken into custody until the state of Washington waived its right to seek the death penalty. In their mid-20s, they were extradited to the U.S. to stand trial for murder.
Mr. Raffay, you're charged. Mr. Burns, you're charged in the cause numbers that I just read with 3 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree.
Later in the show, for the first time, Atif Raffay himself talks to us about his experience with Mr. Big.
It would seem very possible that Mr. Big would simply kill me because I was potentially a threat to him, in a way that it would only be convincing to an 18-year-old kid.
But first, when we return, does Mr. Big always want his targets to tell only the truth?
That's the way you go. I will not say I did it. I didn't do it, and I didn't do it, that's it.
The following program contains coarse language. Viewer discretion is advised.
For a quarter of a century, Mr. Big was an accepted law enforcement practice in Canada, where undercover officers pose as criminals to elicit confessions from murder suspects. But in 2014, that changed. In throwing out a case where the key issue was a Mr. Big sting, the Supreme Court ruled the undercover technique can lead to an abuse of police power and can produce confessions that are unreliable, especially from people who are vulnerable or desperate. And there may be no better example of that than the case of a man named Andy Rose. It all began in the interior of British Columbia, near the little town of Chetwynd. It was 1983, and a young couple from Germany came to northern BC to experience the Canadian wilderness. They would get more than they bargained for. In a heavily wooded area, for some reason, someone shot them to death. For 6 years, the case went nowhere, until a local woman came forward with a very strange story. She said on the night of the murders in 1983, a friend of hers, a man named Andy Rose, had come to her trailer in blood-soaked jeans. She said he told her he'd just killed 2 people. Then she apparently forgot all about it, until 6 years later, when in the company of a police informant, she recorded this phone call with Andy Rose, and out of the blue, brings up the murders.
You come home when they told me that you killed 2 people.
I might be a less, but I ain't no fucking murder.
But despite his adamant denials, RCMP officers arrested Rose and charged him with the double murder, as he told Lyndon McIntyre when the Fifth Estate first investigated.
I told him they're nuts, you know. You don't just one night decide you need some dollars, you're going to kill 2 people.
There was no forensic evidence tying Andy Rose to the crimes, no murder weapon, and no confession to the police. But based solely on the testimony of that local woman, over the next dozen years, he would be tried and convicted of the murders, sent to prison, released on appeal, retried, convicted again, and released on appeal again. In 1999, Andy Rose was out on bail, waiting for his 3rd trial. an alcoholic, jobless, and broke, when he bumped into a man he thought was a member of a criminal gang looking for some help.
He started asking me, you know, can I help him out and all this kind of stuff. I'll give you $50. Yeah, and I was flat broke.
Money, big fella.
But those $50 became 100, then 200, then 400.
Yeah.
Cross town.
It was easy, you know.
You died and gone to heaven.
God.
It's in this Winnipeg hotel that he's introduced to the man he thinks is the crime gang's boss. In actual fact, once again, it's RCMP Sergeant Al Hazlitt playing Mr. Big, promising he can make the case go away if Rose proves what he'd be willing to do for the gang by admitting to his past crime, like that double murder long ago.
I know I can help you, there's no doubt about that. Do I want to help you? That's the fucking thing I gotta decide.
The problem is that Andy Rose insists he's not guilty.
I did not do it. Yeah, that's a lie. That's a fucking lie right off the bat. Because everything I fucking found out about it, the evidence is all fucking there. They convicted you twice on the fucking thing and they can convict you a third time. Listen, I don't give a fuck. Do not lie to you.
Sounding desperate, Rose repeatedly protests his innocence.
You're just gonna lie to me. I will not say I did it. When I didn't do it, and I didn't do it, and that's it.
But on screen, Al Hazlitt as Mr. Big seems unmoved.
Go downstairs to the lounge. Have one fucking beer, think of this over. So I'm not gonna come back off and say I killed him.
I stopped counting at a dozen times. He said, no, I didn't do this. Why would I say I did it if I didn't do it? You were Mr. Big. What was your approach to him?
The police have a job to do. The public expect the police to do a thorough job. Just because someone denies it initially, if we got up and walked away on any crime because someone denies it, there'd be a lot of crime not solved in this country, in any country.
But defense counsel Marie Henein says capitalizing on a weakness like desperation not to return to jail can produce a flawed result.
Nobody says the police are supposed to have their hands tied and not engage in that. But let's go back to the fundamental problem. If in utilizing and taking advantage of someone's weakness, what I am eliciting is an unreliable confession, we have to guard against that. So that's the fundamental problem here.
Watch what happens next. Rose returns not from one beer, but 2 hours in the bar, and apparently from being coached on what to tell Mr. Big to get his help. An undercover officer suggests to him it must have been his drunken alter ego, who they call Andy 2, who committed the killings.
Is that true, Andy? Yep. Yeah? I need your help. Well, and maybe I was blocked out. I was Andy 2, right? Mm-hmm. Can I get your help or what? Well, please. Well, we'll go with I did, okay? Did you offer those to people? Yes. Okay.
It's as expansive as the Rose confession gets. We'll go with I did it.
Definitively, are you focusing on the inherent weakness of these people, whatever it may be?
Not weakness, no. No, not a weakness. These people come at their own free will. They want to be involved. They are interested in what's happening in their lifestyle, and so they come along.
Again, in the case of Andy Rose, Marie Henein doesn't see it the same way.
And after repeatedly protesting his innocence, repeatedly and aggressively, he's told to go have a drink and comes back and says, I'll go with it. That's his confession. And you have that problem in a number of those cases. Okay, cameras off, we're good, we've got our confession.
Andy Rose's so-called confession brought him to trial for the 1983 murders for a third time. The prosecutor finally refused to proceed, despite Mr. Big citing a lack of credible evidence. Despite the debacle of the Rose case, hundreds of Canadian murder convictions have turned on confessions to Mr. Big, and many in law enforcement are still convinced they are reliable.
In one capacity or another, I've probably been involved in, I would just say, roughly 50 of these types of investigations, posing as a crime boss around 20, 25 times.
This man was also an RCMP officer who played the Mr. Big role. For security reasons, we've agreed to disguise his appearance and withhold his name. He insists the undercover operation is often the only way to resolve the most emotional of cold cases, homicides.
That's why the Mr. Big crime boss is needed so badly, because those crimes that go on, those murders that go unsolved for many, many years around the books, generally speaking, the only ability that the police have to solve them is by using the Mr. Big scenario, and they're targeting logical offenders to do that.
But he acknowledges errors sometimes happen, even confessing to a crime that person did not, in fact, commit.
And how often does that, or has that happened?
It can happen, yeah. In my own experience, that's happened to me once. I've also had people deny any responsibility and proven to be truthful, because that's all we want. We're not. It's not about getting the confession at the end of the day.
That's the gun that you used.
After the break.
On the advice of my lawyer, I have nothing further to say. Are you a fucking parent?
The Mr. Big target who got his revenge.
I don't know what these people think they are. They think they're God. They make me very angry with that kind of power.
The following program contains coarse language. Viewer discretion is advised.
His name is Jason Dix. He lives in Western Canada. And his encounter with Mr. Big almost 20 years ago is still an object lesson to both supporters and opponents of the controversial undercover technique.
You have an emergency?
It all started in 1994 with a call to 911 in Edmonton.
Yes, we do. We have 2 fatalities. There's been 2 men electrocuted.
2 machinists at a recycling plant were found dead in a pool of blood. James Dieter and a co-worker. RCMP officers at the scene soon agreed with that 911 call. It was a terrible workplace accident. But investigators had overlooked some obvious clues. It couldn't have been electrocution because the plant's power was off. And they'd missed something even bigger, the 3 bullet holes in each of the victims' heads, found later in the autopsies. At the time, when the Fifth Estate asked about that mistake, RCMP Inspector Peter Ledarchuk argued it might not have been easy to identify the gunshot wounds.
The bike patrol did, yeah.
If there's a large amount of blood present and it's in the hair, unless it's a very close examination, you could miss it. There's no doubt about it. There was a mistake made.
Because they'd assumed it was an accident, investigators never searched for the usual forensic evidence, like fingerprints or DNA. And there were no eyewitnesses. But the RCMP still managed to come up with a motive for the murders, and with a suspect. That suspicious person was Jason Dix. This is how he appeared a decade and a half ago in our original story. Police knew Dix had spent the night before the murders at a local bar with 2 companions and a co-worker, James Dieter, and a woman with whom Dix was having an affair. Police soon decided it must be a love triangle gone wrong, that Dix was jealous of James Dieter and afraid his pal would tell his wife about his extramarital relationship. Investigators concluded the next morning, Dix drove to the plant where James Dieter worked and fired 3 bullets into his head, also killing another employee to eliminate the only witness. Despite the lack of crime scene evidence, RCMP investigators originally decided the fatal shots were fired sometime between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. the day of the killings. But Jason Dix had an ironclad alibi until about 11:40 a.m. that morning. So the RCMP had a choice, change their suspect or change the time of death. They did the latter, saying the murders had really taken place just before noon.
Your officers decide that the murders took place.
Former Fifth Estate host Victor Malarick asked Inspector Ledarchuk if the new time of death was a convenient way to pin the blame on Dix.
But we determined that that's when the deaths occurred, between those time frames you mentioned.
But there is no evidence.
Well, you either accept it or you don't.
So that was the Mounties' official story, and they were sticking to it. But they knew for a conviction they'd need more. A confession from Jason Dix. Thus began an elaborate 13-month investigation with extensive surveillance, leading to a Mr. Big operation. The approach is the tried and true lure of easy money from Mr. Big's gang. And Dix tries to impress his new friend with tough talk of his own, even about how to commit a murder.
Military planning and efficiency and time to the last second and everything. And no fucking detail, like not even a fucking ear cap or a fucking hair out of the place. No, you pay me money, I'll do it. No problem.
The Fifth Estate asked him about that, too.
Can you understand why people hearing those kind of words would think you are a killer and that you probably killed these two men?
Well, yeah, I could see the fact that, you know, I'm talking on the wiretaps to this undercover operator, and I'm talking like, you know, I've done it before or whatever. And sure, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I was all screwed up at the time, so.
But for all the booze and bravado, there was still no confession from Jason Dix. So in a last desperate attempt, the Mr. Big gang takes Dix to a remote location in northern BC, supposedly for some criminal business. In fact, they were there to stage a murder, or at least the appearance of one. To try to pry yet again a confession from Dix about the recycling plant killings.
As far as the law is concerned, is that acceptable?
Absolutely not. In this context, it's extremely concerning that a person would subsequently confess after they've seen a person kill someone else. But at the end of the day, that's what we're worried about, that the person confesses for reasons that are not true. And we know there are false confessions.
For all the persuasion and the pressure, Jason Dix never confessed. Eventually, he was arrested and charged with murder anyway. At that point, the Edmonton RCMP took over. This was no longer Mr. Big. It was a real police interrogation. Dix subjected to an aggressive 11-hour ordeal.
That's the gun that you used. On the advice of my lawyer, I have nothing further to say. Are you a fucking parent? Ha! I asked you a fucking question. Fucking answer me, you fucking parent!
Listen, James, I tell you.
Then, incredibly, they even conducted an interview with Jason Dix's obviously bewildered 4-year-old son.
Are you a smart boy? Mm-hmm. Are you really smart? Did your dad kill somebody?
I never been there.
Like, how did he kill him?
I didn't with him. I wasn't with him.
Oh, so nobody's told you.
Through it all, Jason Dix was kept behind bars, without bail, for almost 2 years. But when the case went to court, it didn't last long. In the end, the murder charges against Jason Dix were dismissed for lack of evidence. In September 1998, he walked out a free man.
Mr. Dix, how do you feel today?
I feel wonderful. It's been a very long time.
That's when Dix did what no other target of Mr. Big has ever done, before or since. He sued the RCMP for malicious prosecution, and he was eventually awarded $765,000 in damages.
I was at home and I watched the segment on the Dix case.
This former Mr. Big was not personally involved in the Dix case, but he says he did see the Fifth Estate coverage of it.
Which I think is fair to say is not one of the shining moments in the Mr. Big legend.
Not only that, it's not shining moments in policing either. There's a lot of mistakes that were made in that case. It was very unfortunate because, again, 2 innocent men were killed there, and I just feel terrible for their families. But it was fraught with errors and mistakes right from the initial crime scene when it was deemed to be an electrocution versus an execution. And it started right from day one, unfortunately, with that case.
It's all taken an obvious toll on Jason Dix. He lost his job, his family. But even after the dismissal of the charges and the $750,000 he got to make it right, for many in law enforcement, Jason Dix is still seen as the Mr. Big target who got away with it.
They had nothing but...
Knowing some police still think he's guilty may make him angrier than anything else.
I don't know what these people think they are. They think they're God. They make me very angry. with that kind of power in people that can say stuff like that. It just makes me very angry.
When we return, did the most infamous Mr. Big targets, Canadian teenagers Atif Raffet and Sebastian Burns, get what they deserved? From behind bars, a grown-up Raffet speaks to us.
Mr. Big operation essentially makes you try to be as plausible as you can in your false confession. And that plausibility is then what convinces a juror or someone else that, oh, it must be true, it must be true.
The following program contains coarse language. Viewer discretion is advised.
All rise for the jury.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Glenn Sebastian Burns, guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree as charged in count 1, verdict form 1F. We, the jury, find the defendant, Atif Ahmed Raffet, guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree as charged in count 3.
In 2004, Canadian boyhood friends Atif Raffet and Sebastian Burns were convicted of murdering Raffet's family on the basis of their confession to Mr. Big. They'd already been behind bars for almost 10 years. Today, a decade later, they're inmates here at the Monroe Correctional Center outside Seattle, Washington. Should nothing change legally, they will both die in prison. Now almost 40, the two men have taken different paths during their time as inmates. Sebastian Burns has spent almost half of his in solitary confinement. He's reported to be psychologically unstable. As for Atif Raffet, the former Ivy League student has devoted himself to reading and writing, advocating in this promotional YouTube video for prison university courses.
Couldn't imagine what my life would be like without University Beyond Bars. Glad to see that it just kept getting better and better, right? I mean, the program expanded and there were more classes.
But Raffet penned an essay for a leading Canadian magazine, describing himself as damaged and declining.
Hi there, coming for a visit to Atif Raffet. I think he's in the reformatory unit.
Okay, you're going to take a right at this intersection.
Okay.
Base of my tower to find parking.
When we tried to visit Raffet, we weren't allowed to take our cameras inside. So afterwards, we arranged to record a phone call with him. He had to call us.
You have a global Tel-Link prepaid call from
Atif Raffet,
an inmate at Monroe Correctional Complex. To accept this call, press 5 now.
It would be his first interview since his conviction a decade ago.
Hello?
Hello, Atif.
Hello.
Thank you for calling us.
We told him we wanted to hear about the Mr. Big undercover operation as he saw it. He says in Vancouver, after the murders, he was angry when he learned Sebastian Burns had got him involved with the supposed crime gang that might somehow influence their case.
I mean, I didn't approve of the thing at all from the beginning. It seemed like nothing that I wanted to have much to do with.
He claims they never intended to do anything violent for the crime boss, but they were willing to say whatever was necessary to get his help. Remember how Raffet described the murders to Mr. Big, as if trying to appear to be a killer, but a level-headed one.
How's the way you killed your parents and my daughter and sister?
Pretty rotten, but it's tempered by the fact that I felt that it was necessary.
What?
It was necessary to, I guess, achieve what I wanted to achieve in this life.
When you said to him that you felt rotten, but it was necessary to accomplish what you wanted to in life, how had you decided to put it that way?
That seemed the best way that I could come up with to try and make him seem like, oh, I'm not some crazy weirdo. I didn't want to become, a hitman for him. I was just as concerned as Sebastian was not to ever have to do anything like that.
You think that didn't make you sound like somebody who was willing to kill for money?
I wanted to indicate to him that this is not something that I'm ever going to do, and yet, at the same time, I'm not ever going to rat you out. I'm not going to do anything to compromise your organization.
During their murder trial in Washington, RCMP Sergeant Al Hazlitt, who played the role of Mr. Big, was a witness, his face partially hidden for security purposes. He was asked by the defense if, as Raffaele claims, the two teenage boys might have told the crime boss what he wanted to hear, out of fear.
Sebastian could easily, very easily, have believed that you and your organization would hurt people if they crossed you, right?
He could have believed it, yes.
And that you would kill people if they ever crossed you, right?
Well, I've never said that. It goes to Sebastian Burns' imagination.
We asked Al Hazlitt, now retired, face fully visible, whether he believes Sebastian Burns could have felt threatened.
Yeah, I would never have said I'm ever going to do him any physically harm. If he had that perception, that is something that his imagination could have worked into.
But listen to what Raffaele and Burns were told in that hotel room before they confessed to Mr. Big. The tape was played in court.
You want to know what I fucking did my time for? I fucking told to the guy. When it came time for fucking court, the person that could finger me, they're not around anymore.
Here's how Burns responded to it.
That if I were to fuck you around, okay, I would just assume that I would wake up one day with a bullet in my head.
Like I say, he could very well believe that.
Yeah. Could he have been led to believe that?
Well, by that statement, he could believe what he wants, yes.
Today, Raffaele says he did feel threatened.
Yeah, actually, extremely so. It was all a dream world created out of movies. It would seem very possible, after watching Goodfellas, that Mr. Big would simply kill me because I was potentially a threat to him, right? That seemed all completely convincing. And I think convincing in a way that it could only be convincing to an 18-year-old kid.
Defense counsel Marie Henein argues that threats of one kind or another are the very essence of the Mr. Big sting.
So that's precisely the message that was being sent. So when you say it's imagination, they're not making it up. It's because they're told, you know who you're sitting with? You're sitting with somebody that kills people. So you might want to play ball.
But there's still a lingering question about the Raffaele Burns case and other Mr. Big confessions. Why would anyone admit to a murder they didn't commit?
The inclination is to think that you're saying this not because you've got an ulterior motive, but because it's true.
Right, no, and you know, the RCMP are very clever about that. Mr. Big operation essentially makes you try to be as plausible as you can in your false confession. And that plausibility is then what convinces a juror or someone else that, oh, it must be true, it must be true, regardless of all the countervailing evidence.
Atif Raffaele hopes to use the recent Canadian Supreme Court decision restricting Mr. Big stings to somehow reopen his case, an unlikely prospect. But in Canada, the court ruling will mean some cases based on Mr. Big operations, past, present, and future, may well be challenged. Al Hazlitt, the veteran Mr. Big himself, insists the sting tactic has never resulted in a bad conviction.
But I'd like to ask you this. Do you know of anybody in jail today that has confessed falsely in a Mr. Big UC scenario and found guilty? If there is, I tell you, I'd be the first that I'd like to know about it, and I would definitely talk to you about it further.
You should know about it because you were involved in it. Mr. Rose confessed and was
He's
convicted.
Not in jail. I'm
sorry,
about somebody
he was released.
In jail today.
You asked me the question, I'm answering it. He wasn't released because the confession wasn't utilized. He was released because of DNA evidence and somebody else confessing.
So what is the bottom line for Mr. Big? After all of this, it may come as no surprise. There are at least two of them.
Dangerous, highly dangerous technique, prone to creating false confessions, and it needs to be looked at and utilized with a great deal of caution so that we don't end up putting innocent people in jail.
A very useful tool that the police have in their toolbox, and utilized properly with the rules set out, can be very beneficial to the public.
As for the Mr. Big targets we revisited, Jason Dix has started a new family and works in the Alberta oil fields. Andy Rose is a free man too in Newfoundland, though still struggling to put his broken life back together. And as things stand now, Atif Rafe and Sebastian Burns will spend the rest of their lives in a Washington State Correctional Center.
Supporters of Mr. Big claim there is not a single case in Canada today of someone behind bars after a false confession in a Mr. Big sting. Critics maintain if that's true, it's more a matter of good luck than good management. But there's one thing both sides can agree on, that the Supreme Court ruling will have a profound effect on all future Mr. Big cases, not to mention those still before the courts, not yet tried or under appeal. Stay with us. We'll be right back.